this Jigyasa series of lectures. So today's talk, of course, is involving mountains, mountaineering, and making of modern India. So it's quite an interesting and intriguing subject. I would not like to take any more time and request our president, Mr. Arun Kumar, to formally introduce Dr. Gaurav Garg, a brilliant young scholar from one of the most prestigious universities in the country, Ashoka University. And sir, kindly commence the proceedings. Mr. Arun Kumar.
Thank you, Narain. Friends, it is my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Gaurav Garg to Jigyasa. As just have been informed, it is a forum of our association. A very hearty welcome to you, Dr. Garg. Dr. Garg completed his BSc in Economics from Presidency College, Calcutta, and did his MA in Modern History from the Center of Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He took his PhD from New York University in 2021. In 2022, Dr. Garg joined the Department of History, Ashoka University, where he is teaching as assistant professor. At Ashoka University, Dr. Garg offers courses on history of mountains and mountaineering, world's megacities in history and theory, Indian business history. His research papers have appeared in prestigious journals such as the Comparative Studies in Society and History and South Asia, Journal for South Asian History. He is currently finishing his first book on the role of big business in Calcutta's decline as business center in the 1950s and 1960s. This book will go under peer review through the Cambridge University Press in August 2024. Dr. Garg is simultaneously working on his second book on the history of Indian mountaineering and mountain exploration. As we see, unlike historians of rulers and dynasties, he is one of places and development and modern South Asia. Today's talk on Himalaya, mountaineering, and making of modern India is a part of this just mentioned second book on Indian mountaineering and exploration. This book aims to reveal some of the important ways in which both modern India and modern Indians were made. In his talk today, he will be highlighting how the long tradition of Indian veneration of mountain beauty, as seen in the works of Kalidas, merged with modern European relations with mountains in the unique ways in which India promoted mountaineering in the 1950s and 60s. We are eagerly looking forward to hearing Dr. Garg on this very interesting subject. Dr. Garg, please. Anything left out, please excuse me for that.
No, no, not at all. No, thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Narendra, sir, for reaching out to me and for arranging, just doing all the back and forth that was required. I'm very, very pleased. I'm absolutely honored to be here, to have an opportunity to present my work. So without much ado, I will start. And at some point, I'll pause briefly to start the share screen, because I have some important, interesting photos to show. And I would also like to keep, the slides going so that it's, some of the important points, are easier to remember. So the title of my talk is Himalaya Mountaineering and the Making of Modern India. This talk has two interrelated parts. The first discusses briefly why and how mountaineering emerged as one of the important ways in which leaders of independent India tried to create modern India. The second part discusses the extent to which this attempt was inspired by the West. Now, mountaineering, or climbing mountains for climbing's sake, is a quintessentially modern sport. It has no logic. It is, as anthropologist Sherry Ortner has argued, utter madness. The sport emerged in the 19th century in Europe at a time when the continent was embroiled in inter-imperial and international rivalry for mastery over the world and nature. For many Europeans, mountaineering was war by other means, a way to gain national glory and die for the country, especially when they were deprived of the opportunity to do so, in particular during World War I. So there are many books on George Mallory and Irvine of how they were motivated and scarred by World War I. And for them, trying to climb Everest was basically a way to gain glory and to feel the pain and suffering that their friends felt during the World War I. Now, mountaineering, of course, has a long history in which it has not only been linked by imperialism and nationalism, but also through science. Many mountaineers of the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century were scientists, amateur anthropologists, and travel writers all rolled into one. However, unwittingly, or at times even intentionally, they helped expand and consolidate Britain's imperial rule in India. Despite this colonial heritage, following India's independence, the country decided to actively promote mountaineering. So the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, HMI, in Darjeeling was established in 1954. The Western Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Manali, now known as Atal Bihari Vajpai Institute of Mountaineering and Allied Sports, was established in 1961. The Nehru Institute of Mountaineering in Uttarkashi in 1964, and the Jawahar Institute of Mountaineering in 1983. The Indian Mountaineering Federation itself was established in 1961. And in the Nehru years especially, India organized 3 expeditions to the Everest and many allied expeditions, all with the aim of conquering the mountain. By India's independence, sports such as cricket, football, hockey had acquired an Indian following and had many Indian players. Of course, the class composition varied, where cricket players were likely to be more elite than football and hockey players. But the same cannot be said for mountaineering. It had no Indian following. And in any case, mountaineering's association with imperialism was far more blatant. So the question is, why did a post-colonial and anti-imperial country like India, especially in the 1950s and 60s, fresh out of colonial oppression, decide to promote and popularize such an imperial sport that had no prior following among Indians? Okay, so I'll share screen now so that we can. Can you see my slides?
Yes, it can be seen, Dr. Garg.
Thank you so much. So the central question, as I've mentioned, is why did a fiercely independent and anti-imperial country like India, especially in the 50s and 60s, promote and popularize an imperial sport like mountaineering that, unlike cricket, hockey, or football, had no prior following amongst Indians? Now, of course, military and geopolitical considerations were definitely some of the main driving motives for establishing mountaineering institutes. India, after all, as we all know, had inherited a long, poorly demarcated, poorly manned, contentious, and little explored mountain border from the British. The 1962 war with China brought home the importance of ensuring that the country could defend the Himalayas, which were considered to be militarily impenetrable before. So this is a very interesting cartoon made by Bal Thackeray in 1954 when he was a cartoonist. And the occasion was Nehru opened a Sherpa Climbers Association at Tenzing Norgay's house in Darjeeling. And so he is clearly noting that there is possibly a Cold War connotation here. It says Mount Cold War, and Nehru's going up with the coexistence flag, and Shao Enlai is there on the opposite side taking a photo. So geopolitical considerations were there, and it was recognized by people. But my argument is that if we look closely at the period before the Indochina War of 62, we will learn that there was more to the effort by the Indian government to promote mountaineering. The events leading to the establishment of the HMI in 1954 is particularly revealing in this context. The HMI's establishment was a direct result of the successful ascent of Mount Everest in 1953. The expedition actually had a deep connection with India, which is why it impacted us so much. Both Tenzing Norgay, who along with Hillary was the first to climb the Everest, and Sir John Hunt, the leader of the expedition, had spent much of their adult lives in India, and in particular, my home state, West Bengal. I feel as if I have come back home, said John Hunt upon his arrival in Calcutta after the expedition. Hunt had been born in India and had served in Bengal police in the 1930s. Tenzing, of course, was a resident of the Indian hill town Darjeeling. When he returned to Calcutta after his successful ascent, the usually reticent climber exuded how happy he was to be back in his own province. It was fitting then that the first Mountaineering Institute was established in the province. The idea for the HMI came from Tenzing's friend Robindranath Mitra. After the expedition's success, Mitra, who was the one who had given Tenzing the Indian flag that he planted on top of the Everest, wrote a letter to Dr. B.C. Roy, then West Bengal's chief minister, in which he threw down the leader a challenge. He said, "If you start a mountain institute in Darjeeling, it will go down in history that you are the creator of modern India." Roy took the bait. In announcing his interest in the proposal, Roy clarified why he wanted to promote mountaineering in his state and the country. Mountaineering, he said, was not a hobby, but it helped mold a character and instill self-confidence, discipline, initiative, and determination. Pandit Nehru, who readily agreed to help establish HMI, also praised the ascent of the Everest in 1953 in similar terms. He said, "This is the way nations grow. This is the way communities become strong and great." In another speech, he said that the ascent of Everest was a feat of great daring because it was a symbol of the courage of a human being. And if there is such courage in our nation, we shall climb mountains higher than the Everest. In other words, for leaders like B.C. Roy, Pandit Nehru, and ordinary citizens like Rabindranath Mitra, mountaineering emerged as one of the ways in which a modern India could be developed by creating a new modern Indian. This new modern Indian would be confident, disciplined, determined, and motivated. This was a widespread sentiment at the time in the early 1950s. Take, for example, the Allahabad-based newspaper Leader, which noted that in India, the progress of many a national building institution is hampered by internal strife and party politics. The local bodies are an instance in point. I work on Calcutta Municipal Corporation, so I know what that would mean. So the Leader said, Everest training has an educative value. This is perhaps why Nehru became Tenzing Norgay's patron. So this is a picture postcard that was widely circulated in the 1950s and 60s. There's Nehru with Tenzing and Tenzing's wife. In fact, Nehru opened his closet and offered all his clothes and caps to Tenzing because the latter did not have adequate clothes, especially for his visit to London. Nehru only kept the Gandhi topi out of bounds for Tenzing because he specifically did not want Tenzing to get drawn into Indian politics. Tenzing thus could stand apart and above the country's democratic politics, just like the Himalayas themselves. It should then come as little surprise that Tenzing was also appointed the first field director of the HMI. While handing him the charge, Nehru told Tenzing, "Now you will make 1,000 Tenzings." In other words, Indians who, like him, were humble, quiet, hardworking, motivated, capable, disciplined, affable, and adventurous in their own ways. A lot was done to popularize mountaineering. Institutes were opened, books on mountaineering and mountain travels were published in many languages, and often in many of these books, you would find forewords or preface written by the Prime Minister Nehru himself to make them more sellable. When the All India expedition finally climbed Everest in 1965, a commemorative stamp honoring the achievement was released and widely circulated. So this was a booklet with the stamp, and there was a description of the whole achievement and why it was carried out, and words by various leaders. Now, this was done to create, as I've mentioned, a new Indian. But the question is this: as inspiring and rousing as this story may be, it raises the following question, which brings us back to what I began with. If this new Indian was modeled on the figure of the mountaineer, this figure was extremely controversial. The mountaineer was usually white and imperialist. So for example, this is Tillman, Shipton, Smith. These were British mountaineers in the interwar years, and I work a lot on them. They were the three good guys. And they still, when you read their works, we will see elements of that racial superiority coming in, or some sort of a deep commitment to colonialism coming in. Others, of course, like Francis Younghusband, we know what they were up to. So the question is, if these figures were usually white and imperialists, that's how the mountaineers were in the British era and the late colonial era, what was so Indian about the new Indian that our leaders were trying to create? Again, if the new Indian was modeled on the figure of the mountaineer, this figure was controversial, he was white and imperialist. If this is so, then what is so Indian about the new Indian that our leaders were trying to create? Was our imagination of Indian modernity then nothing but a version of the West? Is there nothing original in our modernity and our imagination of the modern Indian? This is what I'm going to talk a little bit on, and which is where Kalidas and all those people will come in. So if we go by many contemporaneous figures, we would be forgiven for thinking so. Take, for example, what the journalist Inder Malhotra, who's a very big journalist, right, at that time, wrote about Tenzing's first ascent. He said, Tenzing has emerged as a focus of national pride in India because someone from among us has done something which was until recently only a white man's kind of pastime. But the most complex deliberation on this question perhaps came from Nehru himself. Consider the following passage from the foreword that Nehru wrote for the official account of the first Indian expedition to the Everest in 1960. This expedition did not meet its objectives, but came quite close. He said, "These Himalayan mountains have attracted people from afar. And indeed, it is people from other countries who have braved them before an Indian team went up. Even so, the Himalayas are not only near to us, but very dear also, for they have always been a part of our history and tradition, and our thinking and our poetry, our worship and our devotion. They are in our blood and a part of our makeup. Though trained mountaineers did not organize expeditions in the past from India, innumerable pilgrims have wandered about their peaks and valleys and often spent years in deep thought. For according to our mythology and religion, they are the abode of the gods. Trained mountaineering," he went on to add, "has not been popular in India in the past, but among the many new things that are coming to the mind of India in the present age, this lure of mountains is one. I have welcomed it. The spirit and the lure of the Himalayas is spreading now all over India among our young people. This is a sign and a symbol of a new life and a new spirit that is coursing through India's veins." Now, Nehru was too good a historian, he was trained in history, to not recognize that mountaineering emerged in Europe and not in India. but he was also too deeply informed about Indian culture, history, and religion to know that India was deeply connected with the Himalayas. What he and most other historians, however, did not and still do not know is how the two, Western mountaineering and Indian mountain veneration, were connected. It is the inability to forge this connection that makes scholars and many others view mountaineering as an entirely Western sport and Indian modernity as a derivative of the West. Instead, as I will lay out briefly in the rest of my talk today, that it is a historical encounter between Western adventure and Indian veneration for mountains in particular, and nature in general, that helped produce mountaineering in the first place. So I would argue that a part of mountaineering, the part of the reason why mountaineering emerged is India itself, and I'll try to explain how. Now, one of the clearest and boldest articulation of why modern human beings climb mountains comes from the explorer Eric Shipton, who was going to lead the Everest expedition before he was chucked out, because he wrote in the 1930s that he would be sad if Everest was climbed, because then there'll be no mystery left on Earth. So the British feared that he would actually not want the mission to succeed. So John Hunt was placed in his place. Shipton wrote on his account to Nanda Devi. He was the first, along with Tillman, to actually enter the Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve. For people who, like myself, have come under the spell of the high Himalaya, the reason for exploration is we do so because we want to. This desire owes its force partly to the attraction of the unknown and partly to the natural beauty and sublime grandeur of the mountainous districts. The wish to explore springs from a delight in the purely aesthetic nature of the quest. In other words, finding mountains beautiful and taking an aesthetic pleasure in both the hardship that mountaineering entailed and mountain vistas produced were the driving force for many mountaineers. Scholars and informed readers would immediately identify that in finding mountains beautiful, Shipton was, of course, following in the footsteps of his romantic European predecessors, poets like William Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley, who at least our generation in school had to read. And these writers, poets, wrote about the Alps and the hills of England as both beautiful and sublime. But to the extent that Shipton was a product of Western civilization, he was also deviating sharply from how his European forebearers viewed the mountains. In fact, and this is not very often known, pre-modern European and British sensibility did not see mountains in a favorable light. This is a very famous line by poet John Spence, who wrote in 1730, "I should like the Alps very much if it were not for the hills." Many such examples can be given. This is by Andrew Marvell, who was one of the preeminent poets of the 16th century. "Her learn ye mountains are unjust, wish to abrupter greatness thrust, that do with your hook shoulder height, the earth deformed excessence ill-designed. Nature must a new center find. Learn here those humble steps to trader, wish to securer glory lead." And of course, there are like plenty more examples. I won't read all of them, but this is the issue here, that the mountains here is ruining the symmetry of the earth, and the writing is that it goes so high that it might wreck the moon. So there was this fear. And of course, who can forget Dante's Inferno? So Dante, the famous Renaissance poet, had a three-part poem with Virgil, which is Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. But for Dante, purgatory was a mountain, a place of punishment. It is only when you went through the punishment at the top could you begin to go into heaven. And in his entire poem, he showed no aesthetic appreciation towards the mountain at all. And interestingly, unlike the Indian tradition, the same holds for European pilgrimages. It was only in the 18th century, for example, that crosses, religious crosses, began to appear across the Alps. Most alpine peaks don't have religious names, unlike, say, in the Himalayas. Pilgrimage in Christianity, has always had an urban character, and mountain trails that we see in Spain and all those places are of a more recent 17th, 18th century character. Furthermore, in European philosophy, philosophers like William Hegel relegated nature's art as being secondary to the art made by humans. So basically, the classical heritage was so powerful that in the 17th and 18th century, we find few literary mountain passages that are not borrowed directly from the Greeks, especially the Romans. And, they saw mountains, the words that were used, adjectives that were used were drugs, risings, tumors, blisters, warts. Renaissance writers became still more interested in these figures of speech, implying the abnormal, the degenerative, and the pathological when they talked about mountains. In essence, one of the main reasons why Europeans could not find mountains beautiful, because their aesthetic imagination was harnessed to the classical notion of order and symmetry. Their idea was, how could God create something? God was a perfect aesthete. How could God create something that was so asymmetrical? And so there were plenty of discussions about, how the earth was made, how the mountains came about. They really could not reconcile their ideas of aesthetics with the presence of mountains. Okay? It was then only from the 18th century, but moreover in the 19th century, that, with the Romantic movement, of which people like William Wordsworth are at the forefront, that the brutishness of wild places became reinterpreted as mystery, and the savagery of nature became a source of wonder and moral instruction. To the Romantic eye, epitomized by William Wordsworth, the mountain crag, roaring waterfall, and plunging chasm were deemed sublime things of wonder and beauty. In other words, it was only in the 19th century, so after 1800, that there was a dramatic change in which the majority of Europeans started seeing wild nature and mountains. What was ugly before became suddenly wonderful and beautiful. Now, the question is, how did this change come about? And usually the answers that we have been given is that, this change was a product of entirely European civilization, something that was called enlightenment broadly. But this interpretation, in my view, is incomplete, because there is nothing within European history at the time which could produce such a dramatic shift in European attitude towards mountains and give birth to climbing for climbing's sake. If you want to find mountain views beautiful, there is much less reason to climb something for climbing's sake. Then it could be for science, it could be for conquest, it could be for exploration. But if classic mountaineering is about just the joy of climbing, finding mountains beautiful is a very, very important shift that happened in Europeans. Now, what I argue in my work is that this change came from the outside and was majorly influenced by India and China. So if you look at the place of mountains in India, in South Asia, historian Nachiket Chanchani has informed us, the Vedas did not have major references to the mountains. However, as the locus of Indic civilization moved from the Punjab to the Indo-Gangetic plains from about 400 century BCE, where people of the lowland could see and access the central Himalaya, of which Garhwal and Kumaon region were the most accessible, their attitude towards the mountains changed. As opposed to the Vedas, the Puranas and the Mahabharats showed a very different and favorable sensibility. So there were texts between the 2nd century BCE and 4th to 5th century AD, where Garhwal and Kumaon emerged as sacral spaces whose aesthetic beauty also came to be appreciated. So this is a line from Skanda Puran, and we will not find anything like this in European tradition. In 100 ages of the god, I could not tell thee of the glories of the Himalaya. As dew is dried up in the morning sun, so are the sins of mankind by the sight of Himalaya. In Mahabharata, of course, it is mentioned that Pandavas passed their days receiving the blessings of wise men and appreciating the landscape of the mountains. They admired the glistening ridges of Mount Gandhamadana and other peaks, trees laden with blossoms and sweet fruit all seasons, the call of birds, and the smell of flowers drifting through air. We know the deep association of mountain travel with the entire Mahabharata tradition. Of course, in our Hindu sacral geography, there's also this reference to Mount Meru, which is the central axis of the world. And I'll change slides. And of course, in the story of Manu, the Himalaya also plays a very central part, because when the world is flooded, Manu finds a shore, finds land only when he reaches the shore of the Himalaya. And who can, of course, forget Kalidas, which is where the peak mountain veneration in South Asian tradition can be seen and compared with, say, Dante. This is the first page of Kumarasambhava. And the first canto of Kumarasambhava is basically an ode to the Himalaya. This one says, formed of a living God, Himalaya, the supreme Raja of mountains, rises in the north and bathing in the western and eastern oceans, stretches out like a rod that could measure the earth. All mountains chose him to be the calf for drawing the earth's love when commanded by Prithu with Mount Meru. Because of his skill doing their milking, she gave them great healing, herbs, and radiant jewels. There's so much more. And for me, I find Meghdut even more interesting. Meghdut is full of brilliant descriptions of mountains in all sorts of anthropomorphic terms, which are also beautiful and erotic. So this particular verse is very interesting. Surely the mountain whose sides are shaded with mango trees, which shine brilliant with ripe fruit, will attain a condition when thou hast climbed to its top, worthy to be contemplated by godlike pair, like a breast of the earth, dark in the middle and white in the remaining expansion. Elsewhere, and there are many, many references, Kalidas writes, on the banks of this is a beautiful mountain. Now, this is an adjective for mountain that we do not see in the European tradition till the late 18th, early 19th century. A beautiful mountain for sport, whose summit composed of sapphires is worthy to be seen on account of it being enclosed by golden plantains. So what I'm trying to say is that the aesthetic attitude towards the mountains, so what happened is, because of this different relationship that Indians had, or India had with mountains, this aesthetic attitude was both inspired by and in turn inspired Indian art. So Indian art and design was nearly not as driven by symmetry as medieval and Renaissance era Europe. It was a defining feature of an artistic tradition that was in deep sympathy with nature. And this was noticed by many contemporaneous observers. So when Babur came to India between 1526 and 1530, and Babur was very homesick, unlike his sons who were pretty much very comfortable building palaces and mosques here, he said one of the things he complained about was that the art of India do not follow symmetric patterns. And it's something that he could not understand, and he mentions clearly in Baburnama. We also see this in the gardens that the Deccan Sultans built. So in the 13th to 15th century, the Deccan, the sultans who traced their roots back to Persia, saw themselves as making their palaces, mosques, and tombs as paradises on earth. Their gardens and landscapes were integral to the constructed paradise, but their builders and architects were all from India. And they departed from their Persian predecessors, shifting from symmetrical to asymmetrical gardens. They also began to represent natural features of gardens and landscapes as articulated amongst themselves independently of architecture. So what happened is that from the 17th century, so this was the Indian tradition. Just a second. Now, what happens is that from the 17th century, trade in luxuries between Europe and India and China really started to boom. As you know, Europe conquered the New World in the Americas, and there was a flow of silver. They had something to pay back to India and China for all the luxury they wanted. This trade boomed. So from India, they imported chintz, the Indian cotton textiles and calicos, up to 1 million pieces a year in the 17th century, and about 30 million pieces of China ware from China. In fact, by some estimates, India produced 25% of global textile India was responsible for 25% of global textile production in the 17th and 18th century, before, say, 1800. And the important thing was that these designs from India and China were radically different from Renaissance era designs. So I'll show you. On the left, this one, if you can see, this is a more Renaissance kind of design, which was made in France. And you can see it is perfectly symmetrical. Everything is to cut the design in half from the middle, both sides will be the same. But the same cannot be said about the Palampur chint on the right, where you can see the serpentine curve of nature. Nature does not build in straight lines, whereas European sensibility wanted to do that all the time. We can also see this is another, it's a petticoat panel from the Coromandel coast, and this was sold in the Dutch market. This too is not symmetrical. For example, you have an image here, but you don't have the corresponding image on that side. Okay. And of course, this is also a Chinese wallpaper, much like the Indian Palampur chintz. This is again follows a serpentine curve of nature. It is an intimate sympathy with nature. And this is, a Chinese cupboard. Again, very different from the symmetrical patterns that the Europeans preferred. Now, there was this huge craze in Europe began for these kinds of products from India and China. And even writers like Daniel Defoe, who we may have read in other contexts, wrote a lot about it and wrote about it in very urgent terms, because according to Defoe, it was damaging their economy as well as their culture by making Europeans more like the Asiatics. So it was the porcelain, the lacquer, the wallpaper, and Chinese silks and Indian chintz that were imported from these regions and sold in the Western markets that enabled the European to judge the artistic spirit of the Orient. Eastern art actually startled the European. They saw it afresh in the 16th, 17th century and gave them fresh aesthetic experience because it embodied ideas of beauty to which their eye was not accustomed. Yet it rapidly gained immense popularity, as we know, with the numbers that were being imported, and it imparted a new direction in their taste. Okay? So it was a completely new direction in the taste. And this is an excerpt from one of the most important 18th century English documents that, highlights the change in taste and the revolt against classical notions of beauty in Europe. He's writing, and that English was slightly different at that time with the spellings too. If the writers who have given us an account of China, and he writes elsewhere for India, tells us the inhabitants of that country laugh at the plantations of the Europeans, the European garden and plantations, which are laid out by rule and line, because they say one may place trees in equal rows and uniform figures. They choose rather to show their genius in works on this nature, and therefore always conceal the art by which they direct themselves. Our British gardeners, on the contrary, instead of humoring nature, love to deviate from it as much as possible. Our trees rise in cones, globes, and pyramids. We see the marks of scissors upon every plant and bush. I do not know whether I'm singular in my opinion, but for my own part, I would rather look upon trees in all its luxuriancy and diffusion of boughs and branches than when it is thus cut and trimmed in a mathematical figure, and cannot but fancy that an orchard in flowers look infinitely more delightful than all the little labyrinths of the finished parterre. So there is this clash that is coming in when they see Indian and Chinese art and they come into greater exposure in the 16th, 17th century. There is a sharp change. There's a revolt against classical modes of understanding of beauty, which then becomes solidified from the 19th century. By the middle of the 18th century, the popularity of Oriental art, the prevalence of Rococo decoration, the increased admiration for Gothic architecture, and the introduction of the natural garden were unequivocal manifestations of a taste that was in conflict with classical European conceptions of beauty. Is it too much to say then Orientalism, that is trade with, not in the way Edward Said meant it, but in the way that trade between the East and the West prepared the way for Romanticism. In other words, people like Wordsworth, who were the inspiration for mountaineers, would not have found mountains beautiful in the first place if they hadn't been exposed to the arts of India and China. So in conclusion, the revolt against order and symmetry emerges in Europe in a context of and an interaction with an increasing European craze for Indian, Chinese, and Japanese designs, without which they could not have found mountains beautiful. It is this revolt that made it possible for the European eye to develop the romantic eye, which started to find mountains beautiful. Now, if we agree that trade, that greater trade and contact with India and China from the 17th century played a significant role in the birth of Romanticism and in the revolution against classical sensibilities that enabled Europe to see and appreciate mountains in a new light, then we can also say that mountaineering was not simply a European phenomenon. That part of the production somewhere, mountaineering and the mountaineer was also deeply inspired by India. The mountaineer then that Nehru, B.C. Roy, and other Indians imagined as the new Indian, unknown to them, was not simply Western or white in origin, but that mountaineer was also somewhere an Indian. That mountaineer was a product of a shared culture of exchange and interaction between the East and the West, that colonialism and the European notions of superiority that came with it, that has hidden such deep histories in plain sight, which has led to tremendous intellectual and other confusions that haunt us even today. For your patience, and I'll end the screen share. I hope I was in time.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I hope I didn't exceed the time. I lost track of it.
No, not at all. Fine. Fine. Any observations? Mr. H.C.
I have just unmuted myself. I have an observation, and that is that we used to often hear that beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, but one concrete that mountains were considered ugly by Europeans. But in India, they've always been considered beautiful. There has, at least the references that we are able to read, the poetry, the texts, don't seem to cast a critical eye, don't consider mountains ugly. They've always been seen either as magnificent or beautiful.
Yeah, so this is from the post-Vedic period, when the Puranas and the Mahabharata emerged in our lexicon and in our mental imagination. We can see this very, very clearly. But before I entered into this research, I was of the opinion that, of course, it is subjective and it was also biological. Maybe we are wired in some way to find natural landscapes beautiful. But I think researching this and reading more about European traditions made me realize how we perceive and interact with the nature is deeply cultural as well. How we are trained to look at it influences our visions and our approach in major way. And for me, that's an important lesson as an educator also. And in the era of climate change and all that, maybe through education, we can make at least the youngsters much more environmentally sensitive, at least my generation.
Just one more brief comment by way of factual information.
Sure.
I used to work in Defense Ministry, and yes. I used to find it quite intriguing because I didn't deal with them, somebody else dealt with them. That is that all the mountaineering institutes were under the control of Defense Ministry. And I thought this was just a source of some joy and pleasure for bureaucrats inclined to indulge in mountaineering. But I now realize that they actually had a geopolitical significance, a security implication.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially
H.C.
after
Sareen, H.C. Sareen was the defense secretary, and he was very much instrumental in promoting mountaineering in India. And he was also perhaps responsible for setting up of this institute in Darjeeling.
Yes. So I plan to go there to study the archives in greater detail. So both the geopolitical aspect,
Yes.
but I'm also drawn to this aspect of creating the new Indian, because I find it quite intriguing how important Tenzing became as a model that, you know, Indian leaders wanted to promote. Make thousands of Tenzings was, I think, very evocative for me. And I'm trying to figure out, you know, what is going on there. And this was an attempt to actually answer some of this question. And of course, I find that cartoon to be fascinating. I wish I had a better picture of that cartoon, but I was so happy when I found it. It was a lot of fun.
Mountains have a fascination of their own.
Hmm.
Every step you find a different view and different landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But again, I wonder how much of it is biological, how much of it is cultural. Like I, for example, grew up watching, you know, my father was a great Bollywood fan. So he would watch all the scenes from Kashmir, from Shammi Kapoor movies. And I would myself read Ruskin Bond. It was almost, now looking back in hindsight, I was trained to find mountains beautiful. I didn't realize before how much the cultural heritage has a part, you know, to play in our understanding of mountains. So yeah, I wonder if the 17th century individual, I think, would have a slightly different view of the mountains. I've been reading some some pilgrimage literature now in different languages to figure this out. If they are thinking and writing about mountains slightly differently than, you know, how we perceive them today.
It seems that even Mughals had appreciation of the beauty of the mountains, at least what we know about Mughals, especially
Yes.
the early Mughals. They seem to be admiring natural beauty, although they really followed symmetry in their architecture.
Absolutely.
They did admire the mountains
Yeah.
and natural beauty.
So we see the spell of symmetry slightly broken with Akbar, where a lot of Rajput motives start coming into his architectural form. But I think it is worth noting, though, when they talk about mountain beauty, they talk about, say, Srinagar or the Kashmir Valley, which is ultimately a valley, but not really the mountain peaks. So in Babarnama, Babar does mention some mountains that he sees on his way to India. And there, the only mountains he talks about, he says it is symmetrical. Only those mountains that are symmetrical or somewhat symmetrical captures his imagination. Of course, it's partly true for us too. Kailash Mansarovar is largely a very interestingly symmetrical mountain forms, which is like fascinating for South Asians for a very, very long time. But we seem to have a more slightly different relationship with nature and art than the Western tradition that emerged from, say, you know, Western Asia. And I think, yeah, that's what I wanted to emphasize. The Chinese also similar, but slightly different there. I didn't go into the China part because then that would have made the talk too long.
So maybe especially our colleagues from the forest may have some
I would love to hear their views.
Observations and questions, perhaps.
सर मैं पूछूं सर नमस्कार सर
पूछिए
सर मैं शिवलाल जोशी सर आप वो पुराना अपना इतिहास और जो वो जिक्र कहीं नहीं किया सर भगवान राम भी तो साउथ में गए थे किष्किंधा में रहे और ऋषिमुख पर्वत पर रहे पंचवटी में रहे
जी
5000 साल पहले सर पांडव महाभारत युद्ध के बाद हिमालय में गए थे सर
जी
हिमालय में भी समा गए वो केदारनाथ भी गए थे बद्रीनाथ पे गए थे, माणा गांव में गए थे।
जी
और माणा गांव में ही सर अपने जो सारे पुराण हैं वो सारे हम गए थे सर, वहाँ हम देखा भी गुफाएं बनी
जी
हुई
जी
है।
जी
तो सर
बिल्कुल।
वो रेफरेंस तो आप कहीं दिए नहीं सर को, अपना
मैंने
इतना
महाभारत के
पुराना
बारे में
इतिहास है।
बोला था, मैंने महाभारत के बारे में बोला था ना, तो महाभारत जो हमें जो पता है
हाँ
कि वो लिखा गया था फ्रॉम 200 BCE से लेके 200 ADE वाले पीरियड में, वो 400 साल के पीरियड में महाभारत डेवलप हुआ, और रामायण जस्ट उसके बाद में लिखा गया। अब ये हो सकता है जरूर कि वो पहले हुआ हो, और अगर वो हुआ हो तो वो भी मेरे टॉक से मैं जो बोल रहा हूं वो उसको डिसएग्री नहीं करेगा, क्योंकि ऐसा हो सकता है कि हमारे इंडिया में, चूंकि हम हिमालय के इतना पास रहते हैं कि हम माउंटेन्स को डिफरेंटली देखते हैं। पर इस टॉक में मेरा जो पार्ट था बोलने का कि दूसरे जगह में, जैसे अगर आप यूरोप चले जाएं, उनका रिलेशनशिप डिफरेंट है माउंटेन्स के साथ। मेरा पॉइंट बेसिकली वो ड्रॉ करना था। पर जो इंटरेस्टिंग बात है कि जो माउंटेनियरिंग है, हम पहाड़ों के इर्द गिर्द घूमते हैं, कैलाश मानसरोवर भी जाते हैं तो उसके राउंड लेते हैं। इन्होंने क्या शुरू कर दिया, ये सीधा ऊपर जाने लगे। तो वो बहुत एक यूरोपियन चीज है। हमें माउंटेन को कॉन्कर करने का हमारे में वो नहीं था कि नेचर को हम कॉन्कर करें, दबाए, ये हमारा ट्रेडिशन नहीं था, ये यूरोपियन का ट्रेडिशन था। पर वो करते थे बहुत चीजों के कारण, जियोपॉलिटिकल, मिलिट्री, इकोनॉमिक, बट ऑल्सो बिकॉज उन्हें माउंटेन सुंदर लगने लगा 19th सेंचुरी से। तो पॉइंट ये था बोलना कि अगर वो फिगर यूरोपियन है तो हम 1950s 60s और अभी भी माउंटेनियरिंग क्यों प्रमोट कर रहे हैं। सो वही है कि हमारे ट्रेडिशन में भी कुछ है जो कि कंट्रीब्यूट किया है इस माउंटेनियरिंग को बनाने में। एक जो माउंटेनियरिंग का जो एक फिगर है जो हम आइडलाइज करते हैं, जो एडवेंचरस है, जो ऑब्स्टिकल्स को पार कर सकता है, जो नई ऊंचाइयों को छू सकता है, वो सिर्फ यूरोपियन इन्वेंशन नहीं है, उसमें हमारा भी बहुत बड़ा, उस इतिहास में हमारा भी बहुत बड़ा रोल है। सो मेरा पॉइंट बेसिकली यही था बोलने का। थैंक यू। आई होप आपका क्वेश्चन मैंने क्लैरिफाई कर मैं कुछ कर पाया।
थैंक यू सर, थैंक यू वेरी मच।
थैंक यू सर।
बहुत से महत्वपूर्ण तीर्थ हमारे सब हिमालय में ही हैं।
बिल्कुल, पर कोई भी तीर्थ में, मैक्सिमम तीर्थ में हम पहाड़ के पीक में नहीं जाते हैं।
पीक में नहीं जाते, आप सही कह रहे हैं।
और वो जो शुरू हुआ, जो हिस्टोरियंस ने जो डेटिंग की है उसकी, थ्रू डिस्कोर्सिव स्टडीज एंड थ्रू टेम्पल कंस्ट्रक्शन, वो पकड़ लीजिए 2000 साल से शुरू हुआ है। और वो एक लंबा डेवलपमेंट है, फ्रॉम 200 BC टू पकड़ लीजिए 1000 AD के बीच में, शंकराचार्य के समय वो तीर्थ स्थल बने। उसके पहले इतना नहीं था, हमारे में भी थोड़ा डिफरेंट था। तो मैं जो कहने की कोशिश कर रहा हूं, एवरीथिंग एज ए हिस्ट्री, हर एक चीज का एक इतिहास होता है, हर एक चीज बदलता है। तो अभी जो हम जिस तरह से माउंटेन्स के साथ रिलेट कर रहे हैं, बोथ एज टूरिस्ट्स, as climbers, and also as citizens, it is a product of a long historical tradition and intermixing between East and West, and colonialism and post-colonialism, independent India and all that.
A lot of religion also.
And lot of religion.
In our religion and culture, mountains are being worshipped.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas in European culture, they are saying that they are disturbing the symmetry of earth. That
Exactly.
is more disturbing.
Exactly.
So
and then they change their attitude, but then, yeah, it's very disturbing.
Yeah, it's very disturbing.
It's a very different relationship with nature where, the culture is more anthropocentric, where man is at the center of the world and the nature has been given for the pleasure of man to consume and enjoy. That was the tradition. Now, 19th century, with the coming of capitalism, this exploitation increases. But I only tell my students that imagine if they did not find mountains or nature even slightly beautiful, as they started doing from 19th century, imagine how much worse climate destruction would have been. And this is something that we need to remember about ourselves, that, we have had a far more harmonious relationship with nature, which we need to remember, revive, and go back to. Considering, I'm in Delhi, Sonipat right now, there's so much pollution. We need to, of course, also, as important as it is to focus on big mountains, big national parks, on a daily level, we also have to figure out our own relationships with, kind of environment and go back to it in some way. So thank you for your observation, sir.
Sir, may I say something? Sir?
Yes, sir.
Sir. Sir, very, especially you mentioned Himalaya with pre-Vedic period and all that.
Yes, sir.
हिमालय से हमारा संबंध कल्चरली भी बहुत इतने अच्छा है, इतना पुराना प्री-वैदिक काल में. I was just searching in Rigved Samhita about Himalaya and all that actually. And Kalidas especially quoted Asti Utrasyam Disi Himalaya Vachati Nagadhiraja in Kumar Sambhav.
Exactly.
And in Meghdut, Megh was given this Sandesh, Megh Sandesh from Ujjaini to Himalaya.
Exactly.
And Kuber Nagri. और उसमें इतना अच्छा वर्णन किया है, कैसे वर्णन किया है नहीं कह सकते. हिमालय का वर्णन किया है कालिदास ने. और इसमें अभिज्ञान शाकुंतल में जब अस्ति कच्चित वाग विशेष उनकी पत्नी कहती है, उसके पश्चात उन्होंने जो श्लोक लिखे हैं वो भी हिमालय के संबंध में लिखे हैं.
भी हिमालय की तरफ. और ये
आधुनिक काल में जब जयशंकर प्रसाद कहते हैं प्रलय की बात, हिमगिरी के उत्तंग शिखर पर बैठ सिला की शीतल छाह, एक पुरुष भीगे नयनों से देख रहा था प्रलय प्रवाह. और यही झूलेलाल का जब वर्णन किया जाता है तो उसके अंदर जब उसको बांधा जाता है मीन को, तो पर्वत के शिखर से बांध कर निकाला जाता है, वहां भी हिमालय का वर्णन है.
बिल्कुल.
तो हिमालय का वर्णन हमारे कल्चर उसमें जुड़ा हुआ है. और बाकी सब बातें विशेष रूप से आपने जो बातें संदर्भ जो दिए हैं पॉलिटिकल के साथ में जो संदर्भ दिए हैं, ये बहुत वंडरफुल है एक्चुअली. मैं आई एम सो इम्प्रेस्ड विद योर.
One more thing. One important thing is about the Aravalli ranges, which runs from northeast at Haryana place to Gujarat via Rajasthan. It acts as a barrier in the expansion of desert from western side to the northern side. Absolutely. So that's one plus point for about the Himalayas, Aravallis. Yeah.
Sir.
But just one thing, Gauravji.
Yes,
you have mentioned about the importance and the relationship we had with the mountains from the historical perspective. But taking you to the contemporary times, now that is today, that where has that respect gone? We Indians took pride in respecting and having a different relationship with the mountains. But today we see all around the hills being destroyed, left, right, and center. So if that respect could be revived or at least rebuilt or regenerated, probably the damage that we are doing to our hills and mountains around us would probably be taken care of.
Absolutely. That is why I teach this course at least in Ashoka, at least get these students to like change and understand these things. And as an educator, that's what motivates us, right? We feel at some level by teaching, we can also, like our great Indian leaders have always wanted, to create a new, better Indian citizen, a better human being. I feel that, if we can understand that we have dealt with our relationship with nature has been qualitatively different from others, at least from the Western tradition, we can figure out better how we want to preserve aspects of our culture, and then also change with the times to create a more harmonious balance. I think it is doable. It is, I think at some level, we have failed as educators. I take it on myself. It's my... I can't, Sir Rajendra sir, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on the mute. So, but I think you said that collectively, we as a nation or we as a governance system, have we not failed our people in reminding ourselves of the type of relationship that we needed to have and we used to have with the mountains and the hills? So, how do we do that? It's a different, difficult question, but yes, all of us have to do something about it. Yes,
we all have to do, while at the same time not keeping to the side of forgetting the geopolitical aspect of it. We need to protect our borders. We also need to figure out how to provide electricity to our peoples. So it's up to us. And there are no easy solutions. There are no easy answers to these questions. It will be very presumptuous of me to say that, we should only focus on this and go back to 17th century. We cannot. We lived in a capitalist world. where, times have changed and we need to figure out anew. But all I'm trying to say is that things have changed in the past, and we have elements within our culture, our historical genius, to be able to think new ways of engagement.
We have to remind ourselves of the climate change, the topic that is taking place all over. From day one in Uttarakhand and other places, things have happened. And Himalayas have been more or less not destroyed, but partly we are responsible. We have to relate to the climate change that is taking place, and we remind ourselves that Himalayas had great tradition of attracting people for pilgrimage and other. It is rooted in our tradition. I think we should go back to those things again. Make do the.
Yeah, so we have to do more to remind our own people of these things, and then that it may help us to think about these spaces as differently, because when we go to a hill station, we think it's a British invention, which it is, but then there's more to it. We should not only think, oh, this is British and we admire only their architecture and the rest we do kachra. I went to Mussoorie recently. It was in a very, very sad situation with so many tourists. We need to be more responsible. I think this is one of the ways. So this is an attempt in that direction, actually.
And the mountains are being seen as the source of the mineral ores.
Yes.
Miners are there, excavating it like anything.
And dams and mines and so we have to.
They're destroying.
Yeah, we have to figure out.
You should go all over India. People about.
So I couldn't hear you. I lost you in my network, I think.
श्रीवास्तव साहब, आपका ये नेटवर्क ठीक नहीं है, स्विच ऑफ करके दोबारा लगाएं तो स्टेबल हो जाएगा.
ये 34 हो गई सर. ठीक है सर.
जी
हो गया. आवाज तो आ रही है सर उनकी, दिख तो रहे हैं.
I can you hear me?
Yes,
दिख भी रहे हैं, सुनाई भी पड़ रहे हैं.
अच्छा, तो
साहब
सर धन्यवाद सर. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर. काफी बातें आपने बताई और इतना ज्यादा नॉलेजेबल और इतना इंफॉर्मेटिव आपने सब्जेक्ट को लिया. और इसके साथ ही मैं लोभ समर्ण नहीं कर पा रहा हूं. मैं एक शब्द कहने का, उत्तरम यत् हिमाद्रश्चैव दक्षिणम च सागरम तद देवमृतम निर्मितम देशम भारतम तत् संस्कृति. भारत नाम उसमें ही है समाहित. जब ऊपर हिमालय, इधर वो, और देव निर्मित देश को भारतीय संस्कृति के साथ में भारतीय को आपने उजागर कर दिया. और ये सारी बातें बता करके बहुत नई नई बातें बताई. इसके लिए मैं हमारे एसोसिएशन की ओर से आपका धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करता हूं. और हमारे गीता मित्र संस्थान के अध्यक्ष महोदय और उनके अभी जो उन्होंने हमें प्रोवाइड किया है ये प्लेटफॉर्म, मनीष जी, वरिष्ठ साहब, खन्ना साहब, उन सभी का धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करता हूं. हमारे कन्वीनर साहब हैं सिद्धिया साहब, जिनके कारण से यह सब संभव हो पाता है. और हमारे अध्यक्ष महोदय आकर के हमें आशीर्वाद देते हैं. और सभी का धन्यवाद और विशेष रूप से आपका धन्यवाद. पधारते रहें. नमस्कार.
थैंक